Seguidamente disertará a continuación el doctor Nick Freemantle. Adelante, por favor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I should start by apologising for my lack of Spanish. My students back home complain that I struggle in English, so I will do my best in my first and only language to address the issues of the day. I'm very grateful to the ISSS for the kind invitation to participate in today's meeting, to discuss a topic that's very close to my heart, one that I've been involved in, an area I've been involved in throughout my career. I'm struck coming to Argentina, just like Dr. Gutierrez before me, the similarities in our countries. There are some that I expected, but I was curious to discover this morning, reading the BBC News, that both your President Macri and our Prime Minister Cameron have absolutely nothing to hide regarding their alleged connection with offshore bank accounts. But I think we maybe have some more auspicious things to discuss. That's fine. So I suppose I'd better get on with the real business of the day. This is where I work in London. It looks very leafy and nice, but actually it's in the centre of Bloomsbury. But it's a fine institution that I'm proud to represent. I must, for the avoidance of doubt, share my declarations. I'm grateful to Novo Nordisk for their kind support to enable me to attend the meeting, and I've also received funding from Novo Nordisk and a range of other pharmaceutical companies who, for research, consultancy and travel, who provide services in this country. So, if I go back to the 1990s, I remember well being asked by Dr. Graham Wynyard, who was then Deputy Chief Medical Officer in the Department of Health in England, to attend a series of consultation meetings about the development of what was then called a National Institute for Cost Effectiveness. We discussed the proposal, we did our best to learn from other experiments in the world, like particularly the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme in Australia that I'd had some contact with, and we came up with a blueprint, a discussion document. This discussion document, this is a very English story. I doubt that politics work quite the same way in any other country, but we produced a discussion document, and then that document was shared with senior decision makers, politicians and senior civil servants in the Department of Health and in government. It was in the days of pieces of paper rather than emails, and this paper document passed from desk to desk. And the first thing that happened was cost disappeared. It's a difficult word to discuss with the population, and it was replaced by clinical. The next casualty was effectiveness. That was replaced by excellence. When I asked about this, Graham told me, well, who could possibly be against excellence? It's an interesting question. NICE has changed its names a number of times during its existence, but it is striking that it has always kept the same acronym. So the name changes behind the acronym, but it always has the N, the I, the C, and the E. And I do think that the intention of NICE was always to look positively and hopefully at all potential pharmaceuticals and other health technologies that may be available in the NHS. I see that as being quite different from, say, the German approach, which I saw as being much more negative from the offset. When NICE says no to something, it says it so pleasantly, so kindly, and with such regret. It's such a disappointment that this treatment really didn't quite meet the target. This may sound an odd description, but it's actually a very positive way to progress, and it's a way of handling some of the challenges and the difficulties that are around this quite adversarial process. So currently, last time I looked, NICE was called the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. A slight change in name from the original, but still we can think of it as a National Institute for Cost Effectiveness. So what am I going to talk about? Well, a little bit about the politics of NICE, how it came to be, a bit about economic modelling, in particular how we have addressed the question of having to make comparisons when the clinical trials don't necessarily exist. A few words about reimbursement and a few other issues. So how does NICE come to exist? Well, several things came together. First of all, we have a single-payer national health service which is free at the point of use. So that sort of concentrates the mind. Decisions are quite centralised for many things, and it makes it, if there are lots of little individual decisions, we might miss them, but when there's a single central decision that's wielding billions of pounds, billions of dollars, then of course civil servants look at that and ministers look at that very carefully. I put pharmaceutical innovation, and here I mean it from the reimbursement point of view, in the same way as perhaps NICE approaches saying no to new drugs. Innovation is a very positive word, but for those that are involved in reimbursement, we see almost a tidal wave, a tsunami of new and expensive products rolling towards us constantly with no abatement, with no end. And somehow we can't afford them all, and somehow we have to pick between them and decide which are the ones we're going to take on and which are the ones we're going to have to leave on the shelf. Because we have this central single-payer health system, the issue of postcode or zip code prescribing became a real issue. We have regional organisation within our health system, and it meant that there became well-publicised cases in the media, particularly in our newspaper, the Daily Mail, it tends to be our conscience for these things, that pointed out that people's entitlement to, say, new cancer drugs depended on which side of the road they lived on. If they lived on one side, they got them. If they lived on the other side of the road, they were in a different health authority and they weren't allowed them. And that was clearly unacceptable for a single-payer healthcare system. The political impact of restricting access to treatments was impossible for politicians. Politicians couldn't afford it to be their fault that a well-known, often cancer drug, always described to be life-saving in the press, was not made available in our healthcare system, even if in truth the benefits that people would actually receive had it been available would be at best marginal. And we were inspired by, in fact slightly humbled by the Australian Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme taking this on years before us. So NICE started in 1999, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme had adopted an economic component in 1993, so they were way ahead of the game. Now, just to give a flavour of the difficulties that politicians have and had around health, it's not particularly clear, and the pointer won't work, I don't think, on this, but the gentleman on the right of the screen, immediately to the left of the guy with the glasses, is Tony Blair, our well-known politician, and the lady to the left in the, I'd say, salmon pink jacket is somebody called Sharon Storer, who was, I'm not sure how this word will will translate, who was berating Tony Blair, berating, scolding severely Tony Blair, in the eyes, you may just be able to pick out some television cameras in the background, about the care that her partner was receiving in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, the city I used to work in, which was, in her eyes, quite unacceptable. And in the run-up to an election, he was completely floored, wrong-footed, by this criticism about health policy. And politicians, because of this kind of event, have sought to separate themselves from the difficult decisions around reimbursement of pharmaceuticals and other healthcare technologies. I have to say, actually, it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy, I think is the expression that we might use. But I don't have any sympathy for Tony, just I thought I'd share this story. So, in the UK, we have a broader separation of the mechanics of government, the mechanics of policy delivery, and the political process. The most well known, I suppose, is our Monetary Policy Committee, which exists in our Bank of England and is completely independent of the political process. And it's that committee that sets interest rates and sets fiscal policy in the UK. It does it according to the stated political aims of the party in power, but it does it without the interference of that party. And it's proven to be a great defence against poor decision making in that setting. Well, we do the same in healthcare. Our Department of Health has been separated into NHS England, that is responsible for service provision, and the Department of Health, which is responsible for health policy. You don't have to think very hard to understand that the divide between service provision and health policy might be somewhat fuzzy in the middle, and we do run into some difficulties with it, but the divide definitely exists. Well, NICE fits in with this broader programme, and my belief is this is why we have NICE, because it separates the responsibility for decisions about reimbursement from the political process. Politicians are able to say, we have independent experts, and it is the independent experts that set our pharmaceutical policy. So they don't take any responsibility for it. It is NICE's fault if NICE says no to a drug. And from a political point of view, there is a good deal of expediency in that process. So how does NICE work? I think this might be the briefest description I've given of how NICE works, but it's possible to do it in really 3 slides. First of all, it looks for important new treatments, drugs, devices, health technologies coming through something it calls horizon scanning. Horizon scanning sounds very grand, and actually they don't do a particularly sophisticated job. If they were able to spot winners coming, they might be better placed investing on the stock exchange rather than working as civil servants. But in truth, what they do is they identify when new drugs are coming that may be of interest to the health system, and they start a prioritisation process which leads to, on occasions, NICE doing an appraisal of that technology in due course. So they identify them coming and they mark them coming. There's something called evidence review groups. Now those are mostly university groups who work as secretariats for the technical secretariats for the appraisal process. So they receive the company's dossier, they examine it, they check it over, they check the assumptions, they check the inputs to economic models, they repeat things and replicate them, and they unpack them and put them back together, and they advise the appraisals committee who actually make the decisions. It's a pretty technical process. Actually, they're very good at it, and have to be taken very seriously, I think. And finally, there's the appraisal committees themselves. One of the things that we learned in the early days of NICE was the importance of ensuring that all of the stakeholders are represented in the decision-making process. So when we were looking at an area where there happened not to be relevant clinical specialism within the NICE appraisal committee, and that came up a lot, extra members would be co-opted to bring their specific expertise to the table to make sure that we had everything covered. Not just bringing in doctors, but also the other professions allied to medicine to input to that decision. And alongside the technical people, also were invited the patient stakeholders. And it's not unusual for people who are actually suffering from a disease of interest to be invited to come along to appraisal meetings to share their experiences and their opinions with the committee. And I have seen decision-making reversed on the committee because of the very clear description of the implications of the different choices that are facing the committee shared by a patient with a serious disease at one of these meetings. And that works surprisingly well, much better than I expected it would. But in the end, it comes down to a vote amongst a committee to decide whether to say yes, whether to say no, whether to say, we think probably yes or probably no, but we want you to go back and do some more work and we want to look at it again. So what criteria do they use? Well, the first criterion that is quite explicit in the rules but doesn't get talked about much is the criteria that the Germans also use in ICWIG. There has to be something that's available that is clinically important for people. If a treatment doesn't do anything clinically worthwhile, then it is certainly not going to get a positive recommendation. The second criterion is, how does it compare with other treatments, both for effectiveness and crucially for cost effectiveness? And that's where some of our real problems start. Now, of course, cost effectiveness, as I'm sure we all know, isn't about cost saving. Cost effectiveness is about the balance of costs and benefits. I tend to think that we rarely save money in healthcare. In fact, almost anything we do costs money, and costs extra money that we don't really have. And cost effectiveness is about considering how we might spend that money. Do we get something worthwhile back from an investment? So all it's doing is seeking out the areas where we're likely to receive worthwhile benefit from an investment, and an investment that we can consider to meet a threshold. Relative effectiveness then. We have a challenge. The regulatory process, to my mind correctly, favours randomised trials where possible that compare a new treatment with placebo, with a sugar pill. They do that because they want to ensure that new treatments actually really work, rather than compare with an existing treatment where, if that treatment didn't work very well, then you might show that the new treatment works about as well as something that actually doesn't work very well. So, wherever possible, the regulatory process wants independent proof that beyond reasonable doubt that a treatment works. That's all very good, and I completely support it. But the problem then comes when we move into reimbursement decisions, because then we want to know how well does a treatment work compared with other alternative possible treatments. Now, to do cost effectiveness analysis, we have to go even one step further and say, well, we want to have estimates of how they all work against each other, but we want them calculated, if you like, on a common scale or on the same playing field, or however we might look at it. So if we had one trial that was conducted in very severe patients and another trial that was conducted in very mild patients, then we might see a bigger effect just because of the patient population in one trial or the other. We don't want to be confounded or confused or biased by those kinds of issues. And often we have some of the trials that we're interested in, but I cannot remember a time when we have all of the comparisons that we're interested in covered by a randomized trial. Why am I bothered about randomized trials? Well, this gentleman, Ronald Fisher, he was a professor at UCL between 1933 and 1943. He wasn't a particularly easy gentleman. In fact, he was a very unpleasant human being, but he was also quite brilliant. You may have heard of the T distribution he derived with William C. Gossett, the F distribution, Fisher's information, ANOVA's, the list goes on and on. But he was also a great proponent of the randomized trial. And he said that the simple act of randomization assures the internal validity of the test for significance. What does that mean? Internal validity means within. Test for significance means does it really work or not? Let's try and explain. Imagine we have a patient population, we draw from that into our trial, we randomize between two groups, on the left the intervention group, on the right the control group. At the beginning of the trial, patients, they all differ, they're all different, everyone has a different experience of life and illness, but the two groups differ only on the basis of chance, the flip of the coin that put a patient into one group or into the other group. We then do our best to apply the randomized treatment, we follow patients up, we compare the groups at the end, and in a randomized trial, but only in a randomized trial, by design, there are just two possible explanations for why we might see a difference in the effect, a difference in the results for the two groups. One of them is that it's the treatment that's working, or one treatment is working better than another. The other is it's the play of chance. Now these are two orthogonal, or we might say independent effects, explanations for an observed difference. Bizarrely, we can't actually do anything directly with the treatment effect. Life often seems to lead us to have to do things in what seems to be the wrong way around. But what we do understand very well from the work of Fisher and others is the play of chance. And what we're able to do with statistical analysis is, given the observed results and the difference between the groups, we can say, well, what's the likelihood that that difference, or indeed a larger difference, would have occurred by chance alone? If the likelihood is very small, if it's implausible that chance is the explanation, in a trial the only other explanation available is it has to be the experimental treatment. It's an incredibly neat trick. It helps us do all sorts of things, and it makes my life livable as a statistician on many occasions. But the problem comes when we have some randomized trials and we have some comparisons that haven't been tested in randomized trials. Now, conventional meta-analysis simply combines trials that made a similar comparison and just, if you like, adds the effects together. The innovation that NICE has adopted and championed has been this thing called the mixed treatment comparison, or sometimes the network meta-analysis. I wanted to call it a para-analysis, because it struck me that para was the next place on a benzene ring after meta, but I'm not sure that would ever really catch on. So this thing, the mixed treatment comparison, attempts to fill in the gaps. Well, how does it do that? To take a very simple example, if we have two trials, one trial of drug A against placebo, and one trial of drug B against placebo, and we're interested to know the difference between A and B, then a mixed treatment comparison uses the direct comparisons to infer through the common comparator with the dotted line the difference between A and B through that indirect route. So because they have a common comparator, we can use their difference with the common comparator to tell us what the difference is directly between A and B. Now, of course, we rarely have two trials and we rarely have just two treatments we're interested in. And this next diagram shows drug A, which is a drug, this is a real mixed treatment comparison I worked on. And drug A is the drug of interest here, the new drug, that had a randomized comparison only with placebo and with drug G. But we wanted to have estimates against drug B, drug D, drug E, drug F, and drug H as well. And the dotted lines identify how those estimates were derived from the overall network of trials. Now, it is a solution to the problem of not having trials that answer all of our questions, but like all solutions, it's a compromise. A clinical colleague was looking at actually this mixed treatment comparison, and I was describing the results to him, and he was nodding all the way through. And we got to the end, and I gave the conclusions, and he said, hang on, there's no trial that compares drug A and drug B. And I said, no, that's right, it comes from the mixed treatment comparison. And he said, it's black magic. I had some sympathy for him. Mixed treatment comparisons have become the core of what NICE does. Carl Claxton, an old friend from University of York days, described the mixed treatment comparison as a conventional component, a conventional part of a submission to NICE. And when he said this, it went into print, I thought, I never thought I would see this day. There is a major compromise that's being made, but one I think that we could argue we have to make. The limitation of mixed treatment comparison is that we can no longer simply know that the analysis has internal validity, to use Fisher's words. We have to make the assumption of exchangeability, I suppose, that any patient could turn up pretty much by chance in any of the trials that we've included. We have to assume that there are no treatment by trial modifiers that we haven't in some way addressed explicitly. And the problem is, of course, we can never know that that's the case. It's a substantial assumption, and it does undermine the protection of randomization. So the way we address this is to build up, first looking at the individual trials, then the conventional meta-analyses, and then the mixed treatment comparisons, to reassure ourselves that the answers that we get make sense, that they have face validity, that they are plausible. But there are still substantial, this is often a battleground between the sponsor, the company, and the evidence review group and the appraisal group in any NICE submission. So has NICE been a success? Well, first of all, it's 15 years old and it's still around. A few years ago, it looked like that might not necessarily be the case. So simply on tenacity or survival, I think NICE is a success. The methods are modified and developed over time. It's sometimes suggested that NICE is more important outside of the UK than inside the UK, and certainly some of my colleagues in pharmaceutical companies say that to them the value of a positive opinion from NICE is much greater in other countries than it is in the UK. So it is an important, I guess, independent quality stamp. To go on, it's a bit hard to measure, but some things haven't worked out. NICE attempted to take over setting prices for pharmaceuticals in the UK. I would argue that was always doomed for failure, and it did fail spectacularly to make it into policy. So value-based pricing we don't have in the UK, but nobody else has it either, so I guess we're in good company. For some time, NICE was undermined by something called the Cancer Drug Fund, which was a politically inspired device to answer some of the Sharon Stores of this world, people who were objecting to the lack of adequate healthcare provision. So they said, well, for drugs that were in cancer, in serious conditions, where NICE had yet to reach a positive opinion, i.e. they could have said no, we will have a separate fund that patients can turn to, that the health system can turn to pay for pharmaceuticals. Of course, very quickly that fund ran out of money, it was refinanced and very quickly it ran out of money again. It's now been essentially closed down and placed back into NICE. And as I say, NICE is still around. A quick take-home message: NICE is not the only model. It's expensive, it's cumbersome, it's bureaucratic. The Scottish Medicines Consortium does a very similar job at vastly less resource. So it's definitely worth a look at other models around the world and how they might fit in considering an HTA group in Argentina. But I suppose my final word will be, I think in this day and age, every health system around the world requires some robust mechanism to prioritise access to pharmaceuticals and other treatments, that we can't simply leave it to the decisions of individual prescribers. So, thank you for your attention.